Hi, welcome to Paul in 10, where we're looking at various aspects of Paul's theology and thought in just 10 minutes. Today we're going to look at what Paul meant when he talked about the gospel and how that might fire our imaginations, and as a result of that, how we might live. Paul uses the word from which we get our gospel or good news over 70 times in his letters, which is some indication of how much it was a part of his thinking. In fact, everything in Paul's thinking springs from his understanding of the gospel. First, though, let's think for a minute about the good news that Jesus preached. Mark introduces his gospel as the beginning of the good news or the gospel of Jesus the Messiah, and immediately references Isaiah in the next verse. Mark's gospel and Jesus' gospel is Isaiah's gospel. A few verses on from the passage Mark quotes in Isaiah 40, it says, "Get you up to a high mountain, O Zion, herald of good news. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God." And of course you remember Isaiah 52. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news of happiness, who says to Zion, your God reigns. The good news according to Isaiah, now according to Mark, and according to Jesus, is that God has arrived on the scene. Behold your God. Your God reigns. This is the essence of the gospel. God's here. He's bringing his good, peaceful, happy reign to the world. So get on board. Get with the program. Which is why we find the first thing that Mark records Jesus as preaching in chapter 1 of his gospel. The time has come. The rule of God is at hand. Turn around and believe, trust in, give yourselves to the good news. This idea of Jesus bringing the good news about God's reclaiming of his world is consistent throughout all four Gospels. God has arrived in the scene. The world is changing. Up is down. Down is up. Follow me and be a part of it, is Jesus' message. And of course, God demonstrated decisively that Jesus had been right by raising him from the dead and beginning a day of new creation. All of which brings us to Paul and his letters to the first groups of Jesus followers. Paul, as we know, like Jesus, was a Jew, and we might expect his worldview to be pretty similar, forged by Jewish theology and the Old Testament scriptures. And on top of that, Paul actually refers explicitly to the kingdom of God or the rule of God on 12 separate occasions in his letters. And actually, if the truth be told, his entire theology is founded on this idea. Jews of this period expected a day to come when Isaiah's good news of freedom, forgiveness of sins, a new age of God's peaceful reign on earth would come to pass. And like other Jews of his day, this was Paul's expectation as well. He expected the day of good news proclaimed by Isaiah. And it was precisely this good news that your God reigns that was at the heart of Paul's gospel. But importantly, Paul saw this good news revolving entirely around the advent, the death, the resurrection of Israel's Messiah, Jesus. The fact that God had raised Jesus from the dead was proof that God's new day of salvation, peace and joy had arrived. And this truly for Paul was good news, and we get this spelt out for us in the first few verses of Paul's letter to the Romans. Paul, drawing on his Jewish heritage, talks about the gospel of God, which is the good news, he says, concerning God's Son, raised from the dead and declared to be Lord, which then requires the obedience of faith. And then again, right at the end of his letter in Romans 16:26, Paul talks about the gospel of Jesus Christ, which comes through the prophetic writings and brings about the obedience of faith. Now, many of us have grown up with a version of the gospel which says, I'm a sinner, Jesus died for me, if I believe in him I can be forgiven and go to heaven when I die. Now, none of that is wrong. In fact, it's all very important, but it needs to be fitted into the focus and scope of Paul's wider gospel vision. For Paul, the gospel is a royal proclamation about the establishment on the throne of Jesus the Messiah as Lord, which then calls for a response of faith and obedience from everyone. It's a proclamation of God's rightful ownership of the world. God is reclaiming his world lost through human rebellion. Now, very important, this ownership is not achieved by force or violence, but by love, sacrificial love shown in the death of the Messiah. If we were to read through Paul's letter to the Romans, We would hear him explain that Jesus' death and resurrection reconciles the Creator to the creation, declares there's a new way of being human possible, and promises a new day of transformation for the whole universe. Now that is a big vision, and that truly is good news. Good news for the world, good news for each one of us. Paul tells us in Colossians 1 that God has rescued us from the power of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. It's a new way of being human, as we were thinking about in the previous episode. It's a new creation. Now when we turn to Colossians chapters 1 and 2, we read Paul's prayer for them. He prays for all wisdom and spiritual understanding, that they might increase in the knowledge of God. Maybe that all sounds very highfalutin, maybe a bit airy-fairy. But what is Paul praying for here? He's praying that the minds of the Colossians would be expanded, that their eyes would be fully opened to the new reality brought by Christ. He puts it another way in Romans 12, when he asks the Romans to be transformed by the renewing of their mind. Paul's praying for the Christian imagination to be fired, for the Christians to see beyond the current state of affairs in the world and in their own lives, and to see God at work, to see the mustard seed of the kingdom growing, to see the true state of affairs beyond the posturing of tyrants and the arrogance of the world's powers. Things are different. Things can be different. Paul prays for the Colossians' imagination and ours to be fired. What would it have been like, I wonder, for the people in Paul's churches that we thought about in the last episode? People like Sabina, the day labourer, who was just about surviving, and Primus, the slave, doing one of the dirtiest jobs you could imagine. People at the bottom, whom nobody cared for, who were seen as dispensable, who, unlike us, had no choices in life, for whom it seemed nothing could change. What did this talk of resurrection, a new kingdom, a new creation, transformation of the world mean to them? For Paul's tiny communities meeting together in the cities of the Roman Empire, in one sense nothing had changed. Church members were still slaves. Some of them were persecuted for their faith. Life was still a challenge. But they began to live in a new way. They started to love one another in a revolutionary way. Love began to transform the lives of people like Sabina and Primus. They supported one another through the hardship. They started caring for their neighbours. Before long, they were getting a name for the way that they loved each other and their communities. They were beacons of light in a dark place. They imagined their world could be different, and they began to live as if it were. And within a couple of centuries, their faith had spread all over the world. So what does this good news about God's reign mean to us? Well, we look around our world and, like Bob Dylan says in his song, everything is broken. We're all too aware of the broken lives everywhere, of the despoiled planet, of the inequalities we see in our own nation and throughout the world, war, poverty, and all the suffering and consequences of coronavirus. But we can't be dulled into thinking that the way things are is the way things will ever be. We can't, as Paul puts it, simply be shaped and moulded by the world around us. Of course, we know that the wholesale transformation of the world awaits that final day of God's renewing of the cosmos. But when you read Paul's letters to the Ephesians and the Philippians and the Romans, you begin to realise that Paul's vision is for Jesus' followers to be signs of God's new future right here and now. Can we imagine a world transformed by the love of God? The gospel is that because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, our God reigns. Dare we believe that? Dare we let that fire our imaginations about a new way of being human, where the love of God clothes us and compels us and shows a needy world that there is love and joy and hope. We're called to be part of a revolution. As we saw in last week's Paul and 10, it's a revolution of love. It can start with small acts of kindness, of compassion, of reaching out to others in need. But never underestimate the power of love. It can change us and it can change the world.